Hello, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Hong Kong Library Association, the seminar in this May time. So let us welcome our president, Wilson Ju, to have an opening remark.
Good evening, everyone, and we are very honored to have Benjamin to give us a speech here today. And I know Ben exactly a year ago. We met at the iGroup Symposium last year in May also. I was sitting at the far left, so during the break I get up and try to grab a coffee, and I bump into Ben, and we talk a little about today's talk. I unofficially invited him to give us a talk tonight, but it takes a year for us to prepare tonight's event. That's how efficient each area would be, right? And for the council colleagues, probably keep hearing me talking about this topic about library space development years after years, keep hearing the mumbles around. But sadly, for all this year, we couldn't find an appropriate person to talk about this topic, because we approach different librarians and they say, "Oh, we just started to renovate our library. We are probably a learner more than the one who could share our experience." So we are very honored to have Benjamin here tonight. And let's...
So let me introduce Benjamin for all of you, if you may not know him from this first time. So Benjamin is the university librarian in the Chinese University of Hong Kong since April 2023. Previously, he was director of operations at UCL, library culture, collections, and open science, overseeing estate development, healthy and safety, communication, and other operational matters. He was also the secretary of Librarian. Well, the French is hard to speak, so let me down to the Association of European Research Libraries. So the architecture group between 2018 and 2023. He currently serves as a member of the steering committee of the Pacific Rim Research Library Association. Also the member of the IFLA Building and Equipment Section, and also the vice chair of the Guangdong Hong Kong Macau University Libraries Alliance. Outside his formal roles, he advised the National Archives in the UK on the space transformation project, and is currently an advisor to designing libraries, as you may know, freely accessible resources for everyone interested in design and innovation in libraries. So let us welcome Benjamin for today's talk.
Yes, thank you very much to the Hong Kong LA and to Wilson and President for the opportunity to share with you a little about my experience and interests in library buildings and building design and managing difficult buildings. I think the other secret weapon that I have to my advantage in talking about difficult buildings as a university librarian is that no university librarian wants to talk about how awful the buildings are at the institution that they're working. So I have the benefit of being new at CUHK and being able to reflect back on my experience in previous institutions, and therefore being able to be candid and to share with you some of the real-life challenges that I probably wouldn't present if it were my own institution. So the title I thought I would frame around not only how to deal with challenging buildings, but also how you can overcome the fear and the worry that comes with dealing with awkward buildings, and actually move into a space where you can think about inspiration and overcoming challenges rather than, oh my goodness, how am I going to deal with this next flood or whatever other incident happens. So I'm very excited to be sharing with you on this. A little, you've heard about me via the MC, just my life dealing with buildings started around 2006, and I've been involved in library buildings, library building crisis management, library facilities management, library projects ever since. So it's something which I'm really passionate about and I love talking about. So let me tell you about the structure of my talk this evening, and I should say a big thank you as well for joining from your different institutions. It's very easy for me, I just had to come down the lift from my office to present here at CUHK. I know for many of you, you've had busy days, and I really appreciate you coming to hear me talk about library, difficult library buildings. So first we'll start off with what do we mean by difficult library building, and I'd like to solicit your input to help to understand what a difficult library building looks like and feels like in your view, and then we can start thinking about how we manage those types of situations. I'll talk about the importance of iterating, of being confronted with buildings that fall apart, with bits of buildings that fall down, and ideas that fall through. So often with difficult buildings, it's not only the structure of the building that is challenging, but also how your library, how your institution, how the people in the institution, including yourself, might come up with some ideas, and actually it's not the right idea for the building, it's not the right idea at the right time, and that falls through. And so not giving up hope and keeping persevering is a really important attribute to make sure that you can successfully deal with difficult buildings. Then I'll share a practical example of my work at University College London with the Cruciform Hub project, and that was in the Victorian Cruciform building, which is a contemporary of the Hong Kong Central Police Station. So from it was built during the late 19th, opened in the early 20th century. And then some reflections about what happens after you've gone through that process of transformation. What's the impact in terms of maintenance of the spaces, the care for the spaces, the transformation that buildings go through, not only in terms of their physical characteristics, but also the perception of those buildings. And then the user improvements that can be experienced and the benefits of those through that process of tackling difficult buildings. And then I'll wrap up with some conclusions. I expect my talk will be about 1 hour or thereabouts, and then we'll have some time for Q&A afterwards. So let's start off with what is a difficult library building. I thought I'll pick some ugly ducklings, which are frustratingly cute. However, they are ugly ducklings. And what I'd like to do is to ask you, the audience, what do you think are characteristics of a difficult building? And then I'll try and take input from the group and try and, during the course of my talk, pick out some of those characteristics that we talk about. So I'll put my presentation slider down and take my writing pen, and then invite colleagues from your experience of either having dealt with library buildings or having dealt with people who deal with library buildings. What would you say makes a difficult library building? Listed building, okay. Listed, so historically significant. I might put listed or historic. Some buildings are listed that are not historic, like there's some brutalist architecture in London, which is listed, and they are very challenging. Are there many listed buildings in Hong Kong? Yes? Okay. And any of your libraries in listed buildings? Hong Kong U would probably...
Well, I can't say stand for Hong Kong U, but the Hong Kong U Library is quite a historical building because it's over 100 years, because the old wing, new wings are even destroyed from the war. Something it's a kind of combination of buildings. Yeah, it's quite historic.
Okay, thank you. but that does pose a number of problems and challenges, so it's definitely a characteristic of difficult buildings. Any other attributes that you might qualify a difficult library building with?
Might be.
A lot of pillars.
Yeah.
Lots of pillars.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a classic. Frustrating for layouts where you want to move shelving around and the pillars are in the wrong place. Thank you. Any other quality shares?
One that is a very new building, but it's like a greenhouse. There are way too many glass panels. It's built like two bridges between two buildings,
I see.
so there's no adequate space for shelves, and there's too much sunlight, especially in the afternoon.
Yeah.
So the air conditioning is also impacted.
It's like a catalogue of faults with the building. So we said too much sunlight or heat, too much heat or sunlight, and then you said no practical space for shelving. Did I miss? There were three attributes. I think I've forgotten the third one. No shelving. Oh yeah, glass. Too much glass. Some buildings have too little glass. Some buildings have virtually no windows, and that's another. You kind of have too much or too little, and both ends make the building more difficult.
As signage.
Bad signage. Yeah, that's a classic one. You can tell that if I were in charge of handwriting signage, my library would have that problem. Thankfully, we have a wonderful team doing user services who can actually write and create good graphics. Any other? Did you want to?
Water leakage.
Water, yes. Yeah. Leaks. One which I suppose in Hong Kong isn't too much of a problem, but in the UK certainly is faulty heating. So not being able to heat in very cold winters is frustrating. We mentioned poor air conditioning or air conditioning that's not able to cope with the capacity of the building and airflow. So I might add poor ventilation and heating and AC.
Here in Hong Kong, I think the ventilation would be mainly with the air conditioning. Buildings complain about not uneven air conditioning. Sometimes somewhere too cold, somewhere too hot. But
Yeah.
because the ventilation system is too old, that's all.
Yes, so too old, poor ventilation and heating. I mean, another challenge with difficult buildings is that you'll find that users will come to you and say, this area is too hot, and then users will come to you without any changes and say, this area is too cold, and then you have to police. How do you manage that as a library? And that is a frustration in many difficult library buildings. One interesting observation from what is difficult library building is that often there'll be complete agreement between users and staff about this is a difficult library building or this is not a difficult library building. But often the perception from both sides of the aisle is the same. So that's quite a good mix. I wonder if there are any other characteristics or attributes that you feel make for difficult library buildings.
Sewage system?
Sewage systems, having them or not having them, I suppose both are sewage systems and toilets. One of my first encounters with my job in London was there was a set of card catalogues that needed to be checked against the digital records, and those card catalogues were on the ground floor, and they had just been graced with a flood of sewage water that had gone down all over the card catalogues. So there were two jobs to be done. One was to sanitise the set of catalogues, and then with people with gloves to check the cards and then discard them. But it made it much easier to make the argument that we needed to get rid of the card catalogues because they were not in a state to be retained anymore. Great. Any final suggestions for the board, and then otherwise I'll start and try and illustrate some of those challenges.
Some places they only stairs inside the library building, but can't have established lifts or something like connectivity inside the building.
Yeah. So vertical circulation, poor circulation. Lifts, stairs. I suppose virtually all of us have got a library building that has one of these wrong, or possibly more than one. But I suppose it's one of the joys of being in roles where we are the custodians of life, is that there are some things that we can fix which are relatively straightforward. The frustration often is how difficult it is to address these things, which we know are wrong, and anyone with an objective mind can see are wrong. It's not always straightforward to get some of these things addressed, and also the impact on our staff experience and the impact on our user experience can be really damaging, really negative. So let me talk a little bit about my experience, one of the illustrations of difficult library buildings. This was another of my early jobs at UCL, and this is a space in the Science Library, the MS Watson building basement. And these are different card catalogues to the ones I mentioned earlier, but you can see that one of the things we've not mentioned is lack of care and untidiness, a lack of attention to maintenance and facilities management. So one of my experiences with a difficult building was managing this kind of situation. It was compounded by some of the ways that the building operated. We talked about sewage systems and lifts, and there was a student newspaper headline about 12 years ago, which described the incident that we had to deal with in the building, and it was a very poor user experience to have to evacuate and clear a building because of a catastrophic failure of the system. And I think it was around the time of exams, as these things almost inevitably are. And so the sense of buildings falling apart, the sense that users are not getting value from their experience of using the library, was compounded by the fact that things were just dumped, furniture and equipment was not properly managed, and also the infrastructure, the mechanical plant was not well maintained, and not only not well maintained, but also not well managed. So in this instance, there was some blockage that could have been cleared with preventative maintenance, but wasn't. So this is the kind of bar that sometimes we are starting with, which is quite a low level to begin. And we talk about difficult buildings as in buildings which aren't playing well. So the science library at UCL is in an old furniture warehouse, and that building lends itself. It's got the right floor loading structures. It kind of lends itself to being laid out with furniture, desks, and so on. Now imagine if you were told you've got a new library building, you've got a good budget, and this is the site for your new library building. So sometimes there are certain challenges that are unexpected in the world of libraries. This is the Belval Steelworks in Luxembourg, and after the steel industry was replaced by the finance industry in Luxembourg, they had to think about what do we do with our old steelworks. We've got all of this plant, and we've got unemployed workforce in the vicinity, and it's very hard to think about how you use this kind of plot. What Luxembourg did was they invested a huge amount of funds into establishing the University of Luxembourg on the site of the old Belval steelworks, and they sold one of the steelwork units to China, and it was dismantled and brought over to China. However, they used the other to build the Luxembourg Learning Centre around. And so in the University of Luxembourg, the Luxembourg Learning Centre is built around steelworks. Now that is a difficult building to start with, or on paper it's a difficult building. However, since it opened in 2018, it has had some tremendous user feedback, and it's a very popular facility. And in fact, the elements that make the building difficult are also those that make the building wonderful, in terms of those features that are unique and make the building and the experience of users special. So that is a good, I think, preview of the kinds of potential that you might start with a very difficult plot or a very difficult building, but actually you can turn that to an advantage. And I think the team in the Luxembourg Learning Centre did an incredible job, and they hosted the Libre Architecture Group seminar in 2022. So I had the pleasure of visiting the spaces, and they are a very nice space. And you can see it's fitted out with all of the technology that you might expect from a cutting-edge library, but against the backdrop of a industrial revolution landscape. And so it helps to embed the university library into the history of the site, into the culture that the university is set in. So let's talk a little about the mindset that you need to adopt when you're dealing with difficult buildings. This site is at the heart of the UCL campus, and it's in the middle of London, very dense areas you can see. I mean, everything in the UK is much, much lower than in Hong Kong. So this is very dense by London standards. Of course, in Hong Kong, you'd say, wow, we've got plenty of space to play with, because you look at all the vertical space. This site here, when I started around 2006-07, working at UCL, the site was earmarked for the Institute for Cultural Heritage, which was going to be a special collections building. It would accommodate all of the special collections. It would accommodate a museum of Egyptology, and the university has fantastic collections around Egyptology. And plans were devised, and I was involved in a special collections element with a digitization studio, cutting-edge preservation lab, some exhibition space, and areas for members of the public to be able to experience special collections. And some funding was granted, and then in 2009, the global financial crisis meant that all the funding disappeared and the building was cancelled. So all that was left were two power plants, one power plant down here, one power plant here, if you imagine nothing on the site, and then a big concrete staircase from the 1980s here. Empty site. And so the story, that same story had been playing out since 1945. And the building was the last vacant slot on the campus of the university since World War II. We'll come back to this site a bit later. But after the special collections bid or project was cancelled and aborted, the library said, okay, we'll go back to the drawing board, and then we'll think about how can we make this work. So we'll come back to this a bit later and think about the approach that was adopted. And so when we talk about iterating and difficult library buildings, our colleagues in finance offices, our colleagues in estates management offices, our colleagues in building companies generally hate it when we say, oh, you've built this, sorry, we didn't mean we wanted that, can we go back and start again? At that point, it's very difficult. And so that's not the job of librarians dealing with difficult buildings. It's not to say what you've given us is rubbish. So if we go back a step and think about designing projects, designing buildings, at that stage, there is more scope to iterate, to work with design teams, to work with architects, and to say, this idea sounds good. but actually we're going to consult with our users, or we're going to check with our list of requirements, and we're going to maybe refine it so that when we give the plans that we want to our contractor friends, then we can definitely be sure that when it's finished, we're not going to have to knock the whole building down and start again. Our colleagues in finance offices and our colleagues in estates offices, and indeed architects, get frustrated if we do that too many times. It's important that librarians don't give up the enthusiasm and are able to manage effective communications flow so that it's clear, especially at the early stages of design, that we need to be able to iterate so that we get to a point where the final designs are not going to change and the final building is not going to change. But the place where you can do the most iterating and the most defining of requirements, and I would argue is the most important one when we're dealing with difficult buildings, and this is not a term that I've made up for this chart. This chart was kindly provided to me by Microsoft in the template for construction projects. But the first stage when you're dealing with building projects, and most projects in fact, is the dream stage. And by dream I don't mean lying down and falling asleep and then waiting until inspiration suddenly comes. And I don't mean pie in the sky ideas of imagining that you have infinite resources and imagining that you have infinite potential and doing anything. What I mean by dream is conceptualizing the ideal library project for your users and for your staff and for your institution, and then using that to feed through what you're going to be asking the designers to do and what you're going to be asking the builders to do. And when I say you, as in you need to conceptualize and dream the project, it's not necessarily an individual hero, project, lead, designer persona. The idea of the dream, especially for an institutional library, is that it has to be a collective endeavour. It has to be something that draws on the skills, the interests, and the passions of more than one person or more than a handful of people, and that you get, ideally, to conceptualise the dreams of your users who are going to be using your building at the very tail end, to be sharing with you what they wish they had as a library. And then you can define that, and then you can turn it into a building. When I used to describe my job at UCL, my first job title was Library Buildings Officer, which is kind of understandable. My second job title was Assistant Librarian Building Projects, which to most people outside of the world of libraries sounds like a load of words just without any connection, that are just lumped together. So the way I used to describe what my job entailed was I translate what users and library staff want to architects and builders, and I translate what builders and architects are saying into the world and the words of library staff. And I think that is how you can enable the dream to happen, is to try and work across those two universes and make sure that you can set out, flesh out what the dream is of your library and then make that into a reality. But not in a linear way, in a way that goes from concept to checking the concept with your user group and then going back and then refining it. And you can do it more at the early stages, and you can do it less and less and less as the building goes on. Of course, some of the more recent project management methodologies, like Agile, give you a bit more flexibility at the tail end, but there's always a funnel. There's always, even if you operate across multiple streams and design, say, the technology elements a bit later down the line, you still need to be going through this kind of cycle and process. And in fact, when we're talking about technology and talking about technology embedded into libraries, this is a useful graph and way of thinking about the different stages of conceiving the ideas, developing those into a set of deliverable objectives, then specifying what the requirements are to achieve that vision. Really important point for technology and for built environments is what are the implications after you open the building, after you install the technology. One of the frustrations with many of my library colleagues before I came to Hong Kong. I've not yet experienced it here. I'm sure it will come. But one of the frustrations with many of my library colleagues was, oh, those architects will always come up with these great ideas, and then we have this wonderful library when it opens, and then they give us the keys and they walk away, and it's so impractical. So it looks beautiful on day one, and then we get told off by the director because we have to put posters up to say this is where the toilets are, and there is no signage anywhere. Or we have this fortress of an issue desk, and we don't want that. We want to be able to interact with our users on a more personalised basis and a more informal basis. And what they've given us is what they remembered was a library circulation counter from their time as a student, and it's really difficult, and we can't do it. So at the conception stage, it's really important to think about how is this going to work, not when we open the building, but 5 years after we've opened the building. Is it going to still look as good? Is it going to still be practical? Is it going to be something that we need to plan to change because it's going to be obsolete 5 years after we open the building? And so we allow a greater level of flexibility for that. One of the last projects I did before I moved was another brand new library. And I say about issue desks and circulation desks, my experience and my sense is that we need to allow for further changes to the way that we interact with our users over the next 5-10 years. And the architects of the last project I was involved in insisted that the only design for an issue desk they could provide, or circulation desk or service desk, service desk what we called it, was made in concrete. And so they poured a concrete desk. And I was going somewhere else, but sometimes even when you explain what you're trying to achieve, you will come across some very fixed ideas, and then it's how you navigate the structures to achieve what you need to. And you know, sometimes you win some and you lose some, and you can't always get everything perfect the way you want it, and sometimes you have to compromise on certain things, but there are always frustrations even with great buildings, and otherwise it is a great building. And then the final point on the graph here is really important of engaging with stakeholders. Engaging with stakeholders not only at the dream stage, not only when you're conceptualizing, asking users what do you want, what do you think would be great, but actually taking those ideas, feeding them into the brief for what you want to do with the architect, and then taking what the architects say, this is what we're going to build, this is what we're designing for you, taking that back to stakeholders, taking it back to users, and getting users to feed in, because quite often we think, we have a temptation to think, and we have many incentives to think that once you've done the consultation piece, you can walk away and say to people, look, we've asked users, this is what they want. And then you go through the whole project with this is what users want. And then by the end of it, people will say, this doesn't work for us. You say, well, no, we asked you 5 years ago when we did the consultation. People say, well, we changed our mind. You know, it's been a long time. Our requirements have changed. And that's something which I feel is really important in terms of consultative design, consultative and participative approaches to building. So let me talk a little about the Cruciform Hub project. And this is the Cruciform building, which opened 1906, if I remember right, and was originally the University College Hospital. The reason it's called the Cruciform building is because it's built in the shape of a cross. It's two wings on each side that meet in a central core, and it was designed by Alfred Waterhouse, who was the designer of the Natural History Museum, another London landmark. And the thinking around why would you build a building in a cross shape was because then you can have your really sick patients at the far ends of the spans, and then you can have your circulation routes in the middle, and then people won't get infected by the sick people at the end of the spans because they're in the circulation route at the core. It proved to be not quite, it doesn't work in quite that way, which is why many of our hospital buildings are big rectangles. But it was an interesting concept and a beautiful building. This was a PFI building, a private finance initiative, so that means that when it was acquired by the university in the early 1990s, the government had a great idea, which was we don't want to be spending taxpayers' money on acquiring assets for hospitals or for universities, so what we'll do is we will work with private companies, we will buy this together, we'll get the private company to put up most of the money to purchase the building, and then the private company will charge us every year for 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, 50 years to operate the building. And of course, by the mid-2000s, that was proving to be a very, very expensive way of operating public finances, and most PFIs now, as they expire, are being terminated, and it's not something which the government in charge at the time is remembered for in a nice way. However, for the university, it meant that many of the windows in the basement, which is where the library was, many of the windows had been bricked up because it's cheaper to manage a building that's got fewer windows. So many of the windows had been bricked up, so there was less glass, but also less natural light. And in the basement in London, this is typical London weather, you need light and you need to have some opportunities to see what's going on outside, even if it's to hear the patter of rain. So the Cruciform Library was the medical library in Bloomsbury next to University College Hospital, and it was refurbished when the building was acquired by the university in the early 90s. It had the poor circulation that we talked about. There was no lift access to get from the ground floor entrance to the basement. It had sewage and sewage systems and toilets issues. It was one of those sites which was flooded in the flood I mentioned earlier. It had inefficient heating and ventilation. We've talked about leaks. It had virtually no signage. It had an issue desk in the middle of the quiet reading room. So library users would shush the library staff for making noise as they were dealing with inquiries, and users were trying to be quiet. There's not too much glass, there was too little glass. There was plenty of shelving space. There was no group study space, and the curriculum for medical students was changing in a way that required students to work on group projects and to collaborate. So what students did was they found spots on the floor where they could work together in groups and not disturb the library staff or users. And about half of the footprint was used for shelving, and about half was used for study space. Possibly a bit more, actually, even for shelving. So the medical school needed a different type of learning space. Students were increasingly frustrated with the facilities that were available, and we ticked all of the boxes listed. It is a 2-star listed building, so that means that any interventions need to be dealt with very sensitively. And we talked about pillars. Oh yeah, so this is the leak. This is to say the Cruciform was one of those buildings that had to be closed down because of sewage leaks. So the building was cross-shaped above ground. In the basement, it was a neat square, but of course, if you've got a cross-shaped building, you need to have strangely oriented walls, retaining walls and pillars, because you need to be supporting the structure of the building above. So there were very hefty walls in strange places, which made the whole layout quite complicated. This was the Cruciform Hub before the refurbishment. So red is the library, green is autoclave cleaning facilities for laboratories, so that was fixed and couldn't be moved. And then yellow was the teaching space, and blue was a single teaching room, which was used by classes of 60 to 100 students. But the single teaching room, like this, was split into 3 physical rooms. So you had one teacher, between 60 and 100 students in the class, and then the teacher had to somehow navigate 3 different rooms to be able to be followed. So what we did with the Cruciform, the starting point when we have difficult buildings is often we've got no money, it's a really awkward building, users hate it, staff hate it, and we can't do anything about it because we've got no money. So what we did with this project, and I mentioned earlier about the Institute for Cultural Heritage, the approach was, let's think about how can we, the library, make the case that what we offer in terms of the services and the facilities that we provide meets what the university is trying to achieve, and that we can provide exactly what the university is aspiring for. In 2010, the university conducted a master plan exercise, which identified a need to establish some clear homes for the different faculties of the university. So there was a sense that the university had grown organically very fast, and there were many departments dotted around the campus, around the estate, but there was no sense of belonging. You just happened to be based somewhere that the building had managed to be acquired. There wasn't a real sense of home for faculties, so beyond the department level. And there were a range of services that were needed around social event space to celebrate and to create a sense of community, support for students and staff that could be in one place rather than having to navigate across different buildings. And it was great to see learning resources, one of the acute needs that was needed at a faculty level. And in parallel with that, the university developed an institutional strategy for the next 20 years that was called UCL 2034. And within that were a commitment to address grand challenges, to work in multidisciplinary ways, and also to think about the student curriculum in ways that went beyond. You go into university, you have 3 years of teaching, and then you go out with your degree and you find a job. The connected curriculum was trying to think about greater interaction between researchers and students at all levels of their studies, and providing students with opportunities to interact with each other during the course of their curriculum. And that dovetailed really nicely with the medical school, seeking to create more collaborative and group working spaces and social spaces. So we drafted a number of papers to make the case that hubs, this idea of faculty hubs, was in fact what had hitherto been known as libraries, and that this new idea that the master plan architects had suggested was in fact something that, with relatively little adjustment to our mission, we could cater to those needs, and we could benefit by extension with the investment that had been earmarked in the strategic plan to create these faculty hubs. So that was the way to try and make sure that you're not just creating a library, you're creating a facility to support the mission of your institution. And then that's a different conversation to going to your Vice Chancellor or to your President and saying, I need 10 million Hong Kong dollars to build a new library. And they say, no, thank you. So that was quite an effective way of getting the discussion started. And then I mentioned the idea of dream earlier, and one thing that we did was to think about, okay, so the library is perceived, and in many respects is, a custodian of old material, and we do have some tremendous special collections in our library. So how do we use that as an asset, not as a burden, but actually think about it, think about how can we make this into an asset. And so what we did was, we said, we can build on this, we can build on the history of UCL Medical School, and we can draw on the outstanding work in medical imaging that's happening in the university, and turn that into a narrative about what it is to be a student of medicine in UCL. And so we made that mission of the Cruciform Hub to inspire the next generation of medical students, and to use the historical material from our collections and the cutting-edge biomedical imaging and bring those together into a single facility where we could continue to provide access to core print resources, we could provide access to e-resources, and we could provide access to object-based learning, so that students would have all of those experiences under one roof, and it met all of the different university expectations of what does the university experience look like. And then what we did was we went on a program of stakeholder engagement, particularly user participative design methodologies. We cleared out all of our print journals and put them into a remote store. We used the space that had been freed up to test different ideas. We asked students, what kinds of things would you like? Test different ideas. We asked the architects, what would you like? And then we asked students some surveys, we did some student observations, and then based on that, we then had some real substance to say these are the things that we need to be building, and these are the things we need to not be building. One of the architects suggested that because these kinds of tables were really popular in a chain of restaurants called Wagamama in the early 2010s, we should have those in the library because it's the kind of place that people love socialising around. And then when we opened the space, no one ever sat there. And students had their lunches here or on these tables with screens that were slotted on the end of the tables. But we knew then, let's not buy a load of these tables, and let's use the space for other things that students actually say they want. And so we fine-tuned the design. We did a lot of work trying to understand why are users telling us that they do or don't like this, and how can we make the space deliver what's in a JISC report from the mid-2000s was described as wow factor. I think it's 2009. One of the things that libraries need to deliver is not just great student spaces, great quiet spaces and collaborative spaces, but actually somewhere that you go into and you think, this is awesome, I can do more than I thought I could before I came in here. And then you can create that sense of not only belonging, but of being special in the library. And that's something that we, as academic libraries, can really do, and that many libraries do provide that sense of specialness, which is not a word. So then, the dream, the concept for the Cruciform Hub had learning resource. So that was the traditional library. We had a large quiet space. It also incorporated social events space. Library staff were the support, and then we upskilled the library staff to be able to deal with some IT inquiries as well, so that the faculty hub's idea was going to bring together different elements of staff support. And again, this was a relatively straightforward, I mean, it was, required some planning and effort, but it was something that many of our colleagues really embraced. So providing support in the space, catering, controversially. Well, the surveys that I mentioned, one of the questions was, do you want food and drink in the new Cruciform Hub, which will be your library and your learning hub? The response was 50% yes, 50% no. So then how do you manage that? And so what we did was what many of our libraries have done since, zoning the space, have half of the space where you can eat and half the space where you can't eat, and then everyone's happy. And admin staff, again, we brought that into the library function. So then we delivered all of those wheels, which I've rather clumsily picked from the hubs, the faculty hubs graph, and stuck here. And we could say we're doing all of what you said. We even made the teaching cluster for the computers into one room, actually 1.5 rooms. So you could open a sliding wall, but you could be a teacher of a class of medical students studying with IT and not be in 3 places at the same time. So that was another win for the teaching staff. And then this was the end result. The Cruciform Hub, which opened in 2015, and we incorporated things like medical student artwork, formed the motif on some of the glass. So the frosting on the glass was actually drawn from a microscopic image that a UCL student had taken, and it created that link between what happens in the space and what happens in the faculty and the layout in the library. And students really love this. The main negative feedback we got was you should stop allowing non-medical students into this space because there are too many non-medics, and this is supposed to be a medical facility. That's positive feedback in some ways if you look at it on the other side. So then let me say a few words about the kinds of things that happen after transformation. And of course, here in Sirius Care Library, there have been a number of transformations, and the same effects have been realised, and there's potential to do more of the same. So you turn your ugly duckling of the difficult building into the beautiful swan that it always had the potential to be. And going back to the Science Library basement, so the space I showed you at the beginning, is now the digitalisation suite for the library and the Centre for Digital Humanities and Faculty of Engineering. And all that really involved was some care and some focused attention to make sure that things were tidied and that things were cleared up and that things were maintained proactively, so that then you can release the space that you need to provide facilities that the institution needs. I mean, the institution doesn't need a load of cupboards that are overflowing with old furniture that's never going to be used. But once you make the potential for a real activity to go into a space, you can more easily attract ideas and get people to dream, to use that previous imagery that I mentioned earlier. And then the other thing that happens after transformation of the building is that you find that you don't need to put as much effort into the maintenance of the spaces and into the care of spaces. One really fascinating thing which I found over the years was when I started working at UCL, the narrative was, oh, you don't want to get this furniture that's not the bog standards of the kind of cheapest of the cheap, because students will just wreck it anyway. So if you get anything better than that, you're just wasting your money. But over time, we put a lot of effort into raising up the level of the furniture, the furnishings, and the general experience of the spaces. And much like you can experience here, great libraries don't go for the cheapest, nastiest furniture you can possibly get your hands on. You have to create an atmosphere that shows that you care for the users, and then users will reciprocate, and they will show much greater love for the building than you could even conceive. So we had some discussions with students about vandalism. We used to have lots of graffiti on tables, and then that was because we hadn't refurbished the tables for 40 years. And so once you have one piece of graffiti, then others will come around it. But once we reupholstered the furniture, then the graffiti problem became virtually non-existent. And so it's that mutually respecting users and then trusting users to respect what you have to offer, so that your difficult building becomes less challenging, and that the way it's treated is no longer treated as a difficult building, it's treated as a precious facility and a precious resource for the institution. Another way to manage that particular risk is in terms of identifying what users want to do, user behaviours, and then adapting to that. So if you have lots of users who are hiding apple cores on your shelves, rather than try and hunt students down and putting CCTV cameras on every bookshelf, provide a space where they can eat their apples and provide a bin. And then you have a place that you can say to people, if you'd like to eat, please do it here. And then you manage that behavioural problem by tackling it as a user experience facility. And then you get that respect from users because you've listened to them or you've observed what they want and respected that, and then you can get that reciprocity. And then the other thing that we often forget is that as librarians and library users, we aren't the sole custodians of our buildings, of our difficult or not difficult buildings. And often maintenance staff feel completely left out of the process. And again, they will get the keys from the architects or from the clients at the end of the project and get told, you manage this now. And then they'll come in 3 months later to access a valve to do some maintenance work on an air conditioning unit, and then they find that the valve is behind a solid piece of plaster panelling and there's no way of removing the panelling. So then they have to cut a hole in the ceiling to get to the valve that was set up there. And so there are some really basic things that if you think about how are we going to be using the space, who needs to have a say in designing the space, you can avoid some of those. It's not catastrophic, but it does ruin the look somewhat when you've opened this beautiful new library space and you have a big hole in the ceiling and you have to explain, well, it's because we didn't think that someone would need to switch that tap on or off to access this other unit. And of course, you get users feeding back to your library about how delighted they are with the facilities. And one of the quotes I love from the mid-1990s by Lord Latham, who was in charge of a review of the construction industry in the UK, and in the end reports that he wrote about this review of the construction industry, he said, based on his understanding and what he discussed with contractors and clients, what the aim should be for construction should be customer delight. And then he was talking about the clients, people who are paying the bills for construction. But I love that idea of customer delight, which resonates again with the idea of the wow factor, the fact that you're not only delivering something which is okay and which people will be able to use as a functional space, but actually you're delivering something that's going to bring joy. And with that awkward plot that I mentioned earlier that didn't become the Institute for Cultural Heritage, we did a similar piece of aligning what we could do with that empty plot of land with what the university needed, and we built the UCL Student Centre, which was a learning space with 1,000 learning spaces, and these are images from the Student Centre showing some of the artwork that we incorporated, and it gave a real sense to students that they were cherished not only by the library but by the university. And that sense of love, of cherishing, came through in some of the feedback that we got. And people will say, so this is not my quote, library buildings are not really needed, no one read books anyway. This is an anonymous person who I've heard, and they've had many different faces, and they've been in many different places, but this is something that you might hear from time to time. You don't actually need a library building because no one reads books and people can do stuff from their homes. So when we opened the Student Centre, after a similar process to the Cruciform Hub, we had decided we would have 0 books in the space, and we'd have 1,000 learning spaces. UCL has 17 libraries in total, and it has about 3,500 learning spaces, excluding the Student Centre. However, since it opened, in 1 year, the Student Centre gets more visits than the 2 largest libraries in UCL combined. And it's not because students don't come because of the books, they come because of the wide array of facilities and the huge support and inspiration that they can get from working in an environment that they feel is curated around them and where they can work with their peers in a place that they can do anything that they dream of. And so that's something which is a real illustration of, hopefully a positive sense that libraries will outlast the book as a primary medium of communication. I'm not saying that we need 0 books in libraries, but in terms of how we manage access to information, it's something which libraries will continue to do in the digital era as successfully, if not more, than we did in the analog era. So to wrap up and to sum up with a beautiful image from when the area just outside of this room opened, 4 pillars of success to make sure that your difficult building can fulfill its potential and operate as a highly effective library and learning space. The first is aligning your library's vision with that of your institution, because that is where the funding flows. If you can make sure that your funders understand that you're doing what they expect you to do, and in fact you can go beyond that, then you will get the funding to make your difficult building an easy one to engage with. Working with stakeholders at all those stages I mentioned earlier, not only at the conceptualization or in the formal consultation phase, but actually stretching that out as much as you can, because the end result will pay back all of the effort that you put in throughout the process. Accepting that the first idea won't be the right idea, and going back and trying again numerous times, and often the more you go through the idea, while you're clear on how you're meeting the vision that you started off with, the better the end result will be. And then the final one, which makes your difficult building not so difficult, is getting the feedback from users. Because once your users feel that your building is a joy to be in, then your staff will feel the same way, and it's a virtuous circle where you started in a downwards loop. So those are my reflections and suggestions. And finally, there is one secret ingredient I didn't mention so far, but the image is something that was presented at the opening of the Cruciform Hub, and it was made by a close relative of a colleague in the library. So it's a Cruciform Hub in the form of a cake. And one really important thing to make your difficult building into a not difficult building is this quote, which is not from me, but Walt Disney, one of the kind of world famous dreamers of history, stresses that if you want to make your dream a reality, you need to bring others with you. So you need to get your staff and your users to join, and then you'll get that dream to become a reality. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Benjamin's talk is very fruitful on the library planning, space planning, and his wonderful experience. So now comes to a Q&A session. So I think many of you may have some questions on the library space planning. So yes, feel free to ask. So maybe I ask the first question. So previously we have mentioned some of the difficulties. Because when we thinking of the library space, because the original settings are already there. So if it's not so many money spent on the renovation, with some, for example, some like a kind of small renovation of past spacing, or something like that. So do you have any suggestions or any different thinking on as a whole library renovation?
Okay, thank you for the question. I think that the thinking line is very similar, and the illustration I would refer to is that basement room that was so unkempt and poorly managed that the first time I visited it, I shared the room with a fox who had just come in through the window and just left when I came in and started it. And that was a small room, maybe a tiny bit smaller than this room. I think probably if you took out the entrance lobby, about the size of this room. There was no strategic money available, and it has a catalogue of issues. And what we did was, over time, clear out the junk to start, and then once that was done, start using it for something useful like, I think initially we used it for a project. We used it for a staff office for 2 weeks, and then we realised it wasn't humanly occupiable. So we had to change that. That poor person put up with it for 2 weeks. But so then we changed it for some projects, some low-level, low-quality digitisation work, and then people from the academic departments who were involved in the project saw the space and said, hang on a minute, we're 2 minutes away from here, this is a great place, very convenient for us, can we put more equipment in? And then I said, well, you could, but it's likely to get flooded, and if you want expensive kit in here, then you might have to do some additional work to the facility. They said, okay, sure, tell us how much, and then we'll just get a research grant and pay for it all. And so then they did that, and then it's now a safe place to use, and it's regularly used for teaching as well as research and other functions. So if you take care of the space, and then think about how can this space meet the needs of our organisation, and then attract people from outside the library to start using it, then you can get their minds thinking about potential, get them dreaming and conceptualising, and then work in partnership to realise that. And then that works on a small scale or on a mega scale.
Thank you.
It's a question that it's a question that just came back to me during this talk, but I asked my students and colleagues before, should we bring back the computer labs in early 2000s? Because my experience working in Hong Kong is that there are learning commons, and then some library floors are transformed into like learning hubs, and it's quite cozy, too cozy that many students, they have the audacity to actually unplug the PCs and just to charge their all appliances. Like I can swear I've just seen maybe blenders, or I don't know, they just treat it like a home. And then because I didn't have an office last semester, I relied on PCs a lot because I can't lock my laptop every time I go back to campus, and I believe it's also the case for some students. Maybe they can't afford a very good laptop. They really need, this kind of need is not fulfilled. And I realized that how comes the students would prioritize their own charging their own devices, like 3 or 4 at the same time, over a communal PC. And then there was one time I even threatened to call the police because it was Sunday, and it was in an unsupervised learning commons. So it's just something that came back to me. Because there are I know many university libraries, there are still deep reading rooms, like no electronics allowed. How about something that for this decade, 2020, so can we have some like serious PC rooms? So I would like to hear your thoughts. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good question. I think there are a number of layers to the question. So if we start off with, should we bring back the computer cluster? My answer to that is probably not in the shape that we saw it previously. Well, one of the types of computer clusters I've seen in many places, and I think in Hong Kong it's almost necessary if you're not at CUHK and blessed with the vast expanse of space that we have, but I call it rather meanly the battery chicken approach, where you have just about enough space to kind of get your hands onto the keyboard, and then someone is next to you doing the same thing, and then you have that times 50, and then you have rows and rows of that. I think those kinds of facilities are not going to be attracting our students out of their bedrooms or out of whichever other facilities they might be able to access in order to use computing in the libraries. So I would say where we can, to be generous with our space, because then we're more efficient with our space. Taking the Cruciform Hub example, we did a bit of analysis on how can we make sure our spaces are used as effectively as possible. And previously we had the chairs right next to each other, and students would sit almost systematically. One student, an empty chair, another student, an empty chair, another student. And so you would effectively be losing out 1 in 2 seats unless things were really desperate, which they do get to during exam revision time. But that is 2 months, 3 months of the year. So what we did with the Cruciform was we increased the space for each student so that they had maybe 1.5 times the amount of space they previously had. So it felt like a palace. And then each student could use that, and they could use it throughout most of the year. But during exam revision time, we set it up so that you could add an extra chair, and then people could sit more tightly. And then during those 3 months, you had more seats, but you had a comfort outside of exam revision time. And that links to your other question about students plug in so many things, you don't know how many power sockets to provide. And our approach has always been to provide a PC, but recognise that users now want to be able to plug things in. So don't force them to unplug your PC to plug their device in. Provide a socket next to the PC, and then they can plug in and use both as they see fit. And then provide maybe 2 USB sockets and 2 standard sockets, because they will want to plug in more things. So it's observing that user behaviour and then adapting the facility to the users. Because of course you can police it, but then you'll end up with staff who'll be exhausted from running around trying to stop users, and users will be frustrated because they can't do what they need to do for them to be able to operate. And you asked about laptops. Should we provide computer clusters to cater to students with laptops because they can't either afford or they can't bring in and out their laptops all the time? So what we did on that front with the 2 projects I mentioned was 2 things. One was to provide laptop loans, so that rather than have to bring your own laptop, you can get a university-provided laptop, borrow it from the library, use it on campus on EduRoam. It breaks down if you take it off campus. I'm not quite sure, it's got some ODB tracker. Anyway, it's set up so that it can't be taken away. And then also provide personal lockers, so that students could not only borrow a laptop from the university, but if they brought their own laptop or biking helmet, they could put it in a locker in the library, and then they were able to behave, to do what they wanted to do without being constrained by the limitations of our facilities. So I would suggest, if we frame it that way around, think about what do our students want to do, and maybe the computer cluster of the 90s is the right solution to those needs, but probably we can adopt, now that we've got so much more technology at our disposal, adopt a more flexible approach where we can give students a choice. You can sit at a high-powered computer, or you can borrow a laptop and then use that anywhere you want in the library. But you can never have, and this is something that I was told 20 years ago, you can never have enough power sockets for users. So if you allow in your plans, you allow one power socket and 2 USBs, then double it. And then in 5 years' time, you won't be kicking yourself, because that seems to have been the pattern. When I started, we were still putting in hard data connections, and that kind of disappeared quite quickly after I started doing building projects. So we can now rely on the Wi-Fi, but we don't yet have a clear way to power devices without providing sockets or those strange touch panel things. But you need a lot of power sockets to cater to library users' needs, and I don't think that's going to go away. I think people are going to continue to connect. And then the final point about should we have more densely technified spaces? So we have some areas where you can't bring technology, and some areas where you can do a lot with tech. I think we will increasingly need to provide spaces where you can interact with AI tools and computers and all sorts of computing power, probably to a greater intensity than you can in most of our library spaces. I mean, we have some spaces where you have access to fixed PCs, and I've seen that Education, University of Hong Kong, some really high-end PCs behind the service desk there. So there are some really good examples around the Julat libraries of those kinds of setups. I think the point about tech-free spaces, that is going to become really another thing that users crave. And people will try and find places that you can disconnect from everything and do something deep, deep reading, thinking about questions. And probably libraries will have an opportunity to provide those kinds of spaces where you can switch off. So that would be going against everything I've done over the last 20 years. I think with technology becoming omnipresent, then people will look for caves where they can get away from it all.
So it sounds like students without their own devices will become a minority. This is the frustration I had, and then some other my students also had, is that we don't happen to not have our laptop at home. We just need to finish a document for 15 minutes, but then all the PC spaces were occupied by students with their own maybe 1, 2, or even 3 devices, and then they even unplug the common PC. So that's something that kind of bothered me.
I've heard those kinds of complaints from users as well, and it is frustrating when especially when someone is at a computer not using a computer. Sometimes you see them using 2 devices, but I do know that that's a frustration. So we, as I say, more power sockets everywhere, and then everyone's happy.
I'm quite interested in the idea of the catering area, which you show in your format. Can you talk a bit about it? Because we used to have that kind of vending machines and everything in the library before, but we finally have to clear it away because we found it not working at all, hygienically. So.
Okay, so I'll just go back to the slide so that I can show you the space. So the catering, when we first opened the hub, consisted of 2 vending machines, 1 food and one drink, and then there was a water fountain for cold water. And you were allowed to eat in all of this grey area. When it opened, students really appreciated it. Most of the eating would happen around here, and students would flood out of the lecture theatres and come in and queue for food and drink. Even though there were cafes on the 2nd floor, they would prefer to come here. It was so popular and in such high demand that the caterers for the university looked at the stats and thought, hang on, these 2 vending machines are selling more than some of our staff cafes. so then they established a real cafe, a staffed place with 2 baristas, and expanded the space a little. So they took away, there was a little banquette seating area with about 3 seats. They took that away to make a bit more space for their staff. And then it was one of the most popular catering places on campus. The management was, I don't think it was very popular with some of my colleagues because there was some extra dirt that comes with food and drink, but it wasn't really bad, and we were able to negotiate with the cleaners to provide sufficient cleaning to maintain the space in an adequate format. I think that's the trade-off. If you're selling food and drink, you're bringing in some revenue. If you're smart about how you manage your contract, some of that money is coming back into the institution, then you take some of that money that you're making, put it into the cleaning, and then you still get some profits, but you're cleaning the space. so that's the way we try to manage it here. And it has, as I say, has worked, it's been very successful and popular as a facility, and commercially it's made sense for I mean, this was one of the examples where the company provides the catering services, so it's great for them.
And you mean the catering services actually coffee and tea and sandwiches? And
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
好，thank you. I just want to ask you. I read your one of the slides. You mentioned that you did a survey for users about food and drink policy, but I just want to know that did you also do the survey about the services? What kind of services the students and staff would like to include in this new area? Because we can easily to buy hardware, fantastic 3D printer, 3D something, okay, but what do our users like from this new library building, the services they would like to receive?
Yeah. Thank you. So we did ask students some questions about the services. We were quite sensitive. We were quite cautious about the cons around it, because you don't want to be consulting with students in a staffed library with too wide a range, where staff might feel really threatened. I mean, it's stressful enough being in a library that's going to have a huge refurbishment and having to think about managing the interim services and then what's going to do beyond that. Now, if you're also having to think that your whole job is going to be radically different after you come back, then it's quite difficult. We did consult on the provision of IT services. We consulted on some additional services that users might want. By that stage, we had introduced RFID self-service already, so the nature of the work was more focused around inquiries, it was more focused around support for medical students. But we didn't ask, for the Cruciform Hub, we were quite careful about how we framed the questions. As I mentioned, we did a survey, we did the mock-up space to get some further feedback after we'd identified from the survey what students wanted, and we also did some workshops with the architects, the head of the Cruciform Library and myself, and we asked students in the round, a bit like this, what do you think about these proposals? Does it resonate with what you need? Are there any other things that you would like? I think there were some questions about printing and copying that came up in that, so we were able to increase the provision of printing and copying. With the student centre, because we were starting with a blank slate and there were no staff there, we were able to ask, basically from the ground up, what kinds of services do you want in this building, and then to build an offer around that. And so there we worked with one of our academics, Professor Alexi Marmot, on a series of workshops and consultation where they consulted with 1,000 UCL students, and then they drew up a list of the top 10 things that students want from this new building. And so then we could use that to help to kind of define the brief. And then throughout the project, I've not got the slides today, but with the Student Centre we had about 15 points where we consulted with students, going from that wide-ranging series of focus groups and workshops to online surveys to furniture room visits. We took over some library spaces to trial, a bit like we did with Cruciforms, trial some ideas for the Student Centre and collected feedback from those. And so we did a lot of that throughout the project lifecycle. And one other thing I didn't mention in terms of that how do you draw in user input on your project, is we gave the student sabbatical officers, the representatives of the Students' Union, a seat on the project board for the Student Centre. With the Cruciform Hub, we did invite the medical student rep to be on the board, but with the Student Centre there were 2 sabbatical officers who participated, and so that gives you a first-hand voice. That changes every year, so that's challenging but also quite useful in terms of getting fresh input, fresh pairs of eyes on the project board over 5 or 6 years. And that helped us to make sure we could manage what the end result was going to be. So on services, with this one, we were quite limited, and then with the Student Centre, it was like, what do you want, and then build from there.
Yeah, I want to echo about your idea about respecting the library. As you say, if we are not using too crappy the furniture, student will know. In fact, if we are keep on doing maintenance and keep the chairs in a good shape, they also know, because they will sometimes from time to time will receive suggestion box. They say that they found the chair in the library is very comfortable. They want to buy the chair at home. So we then refer them to the company so that they can have more business. In fact, I think furniture have a very deep impact to the students. In fact, when we remember a long time ago, when we have those furnitures, they are really very plain, very minimalistic. But then they have become older, yeah. Then students start to talk very loudly on that floor. And then later we do a renovation and we make it sort of like more modern, more sort of like this kind of open ceiling. And then we found that the whole floor suddenly became a quiet floor because they knew that this is a new area. People are studying. We should not be disturbing others. It's what I think furniture also affects people's behavior.
I think you're absolutely right, and design does shape how users behave, and this is another thing which I sometimes had robust discussions with my colleagues in the user services department in the UK. Was you don't need to plaster on every single surface do and don'ts for this space. If you've had quality design for a quiet space, as you walk in, you'll have a sense this is a quiet type of space. And then if you go into somewhere that's more like a coffee lounge, then you don't need to say you're allowed to speak and you're allowed to eat and drink in here. But there's almost an instinct that, if we don't tell the students what they can and can't do, then they'll misbehave. And that's not always the case. So we can be responsible and we can expect responsibility from our users. On the quality of furniture, there is a perfect balance somewhere. And students can be quite critical in a good way and are very conscious, certainly in the UK, of value for money because students are paying hefty fees to be studying. And I remember once I got an inquiry from a student who said, there's lights in the graduate common room. They're very nice. And I remember that I had a discussion with my colleagues to say, don't drill these fancy lights that we got into the desk because you'll ruin the look. But they said, oh no, that people steal them because they're nice lights. But the inquiry went, those lights in the graduate common room, they're very nice. But I had a look online and they're very expensive. So why did the library spend all this money on lights, on fancy lights for us? And then I could explain that. I can't remember, I had got some kind of discount on them. And then they were satisfied as I not spoiled their tuition fee on these lights. But it's kind of finding the right spots where you're not being profligate, you're not being wasteful about resources, but you are getting something that works well. And then they were very happy that we, they had nice facilities and they didn't feel ripped off.
Okay, thank you. Do we have any have a last question? So, Okay,
Yeah.
okay, over.
Thank you very much, Ben, for your inspiring talk. Could you share with us your plan for space enhancement for CUHK Library? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. So, I don't have a slide, so colleagues, don't worry, I don't have a slide for this. But we're kind of at somewhere in this space. And for CUHK Library, we have got, as I mentioned, the incredible learning garden, and we've got some really high quality spaces that students do appreciate. As I said earlier, it's not necessarily the right approach to try and come in and write your Bible and then come down the mountain with your tablets of stone and say, this is what we're going to do with the library. So one conversation I've had with our PVC for Education, who's my boss in CUHK, is how do we go about starting to think through what we need in the library, and let's try and build up an understanding of what our users want for the future. We don't currently have a load of money sloshing around, and we're just coming to the end of our current strategic period for the university and for the library. So we will be, over the next 12 to 18 months, thinking about what does CUHK want to achieve, what does it want to be accomplishing in terms of research and education, and that's where we then have that alignment opportunity to say the library is going to be doing everything that CUHK wants. It's going to be helping to deliver on CUHK's foundational dream of combining tradition and modernity and bringing together China and the West. So we've already got kind of blueprint for what we need to be doing. What that looks like in a physical realm, I don't know. I don't have a pretty picture to show you. It is a good question, and I think it will draw on our users and our staff, and it will probably build on the kinds of facilities we have. If I can pick one challenge, one tangible challenge, I'm not completely dodging your question, one tangible challenge which we have today, which is a blocker for us to make the building as flexible as it could be, it is we still have a lot of low-use print material, particularly print journals and periodicals, and we don't have a storage facility where we could securely put that. So that's one of the big unblockers to enable us to be bold and creative about what we'll do for the rest of the building. So that's probably the first piece of the puzzle, and then we can start being more creative about it. So that would be my answer.
Okay, thank you, Benjamin, and thank you all of the attendants. So let's give a big hand to So now we'll deliver the souvenir to Benjamin. So yeah, please.
Thank you very much.
1, 2, 3. One more. 1, 2, 3.
Okay, here. 1, 2, 3. One more. 1, 2, 3. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.